I hope you like this. If you do, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date on all my hypnotic bedtime stories. So I hope you enjoy the story.
So as you take a moment to close your eyes, get yourself comfortable and begin to drift off to sleep, you can listen to me talking in the background. And as you listen to me talking in the background, I don't know whether you'll drift deeper asleep with the sound of my voice, with the words that I use, or with the spaces between my words. And as you comfortably drift off to sleep, I'm going to tell you a story about a couple who lived in a castle. And this couple enjoyed their life in the castle. They worked in the castle. They spent a lot of their time in the castle grounds. They occasionally ventured out to the nearby village. And this couple felt that they had a very lucky life. And then one day they decided to go on a trip together. They wanted to go somewhere different. They decided to go away for a few days. So they packed some bags and decided they were going to go camping. They were going to go off and just see where they end up. And they left the castle, left the grounds, and began to walk down towards the nearby village. And they walked along that road towards the nearby village. And as they walked, they looked around them. They admired the countryside. They could see people working in fields. They could see birds flying above the nearby woodland. They noticed the colour of the sky, felt the warmth of the sun on their skin. They could listen to the footsteps they were taking, and how they both fell in time with each other. How both of them had their footsteps fall in time with each other. And they wandered into the village, walked through the village, wandered along by the market stalls. And they bought themselves some food and a few other bits and pieces as they continue their journey through the village and then out the other side of the village. And they're walking down towards the nearby lake, and then they were going to follow the lake along to a river, and then they'd follow the river. And they'd never gone much further than the lake before, so they didn't know where the path along the edge of the river would take them. So they walked through the village and continued walking down towards that lake. And the lake was slightly down a hill. And they chatted to each other as they walked, while they enjoyed the environment. They're both curious what they would discover. And as they reached the lake, they decided to stop for a bite to eat. They lay down a mat on the ground. They sat on the mat, and they ate some food, and they rested back. They enjoyed some of the sun, the relaxing sound of the water lashing on the shore. Just enjoyed having a comfortable experience. And then later in the afternoon, they decided to continue their journey. They continued around the lake, around to the river, and started following the river. And after a few hours, they noticed how the sun was beginning to set, and they were approaching some woodland. And they were already beyond what they normally walked in this direction. So they took some time to set up camp and have a rest, and they made a little fire, they set up a tent, and they settled down for the night, enjoying this adventure together. And as the sun set and the moon rose, so the stars brightened the sky, as they drifted comfortably asleep. And in the morning they felt awake and alert to continue their journey. And after some time, the path along the edge of the river seemed to come to an end. And they didn't know which way to go. So they decided to walk off-road, to cut through the woods. And so they cut through the woods, went off-road. And after a while, they discovered an unusual looking tree. And they walked up and they touched that tree, they ran their fingers around the bark. And they noticed this tree was artificial. And the tree was against a steep cliff. And it almost looked like it was built into the cliff, as if somehow this tree, if it wasn't artificial, had grown partially in the cliff. But they could tell that there was something different about this. It looked like a tree. It felt like a tree, but they could tell that it was artificial. And as they were running their fingers around the bark, feeling what this tree felt like, suddenly a door opened in the tree. And they decided that they're trying to have an adventure, so they would walk through that door. And they walked through the door into the tree, and it was a path that led them into this cliff. So they followed this path, and they walked into the cliff. They closed the door behind them, lit a torch, and walked into the cliff. And the sounds changed as they walked inside this cliff. the feeling of the air changed while they're inside the cliff. And they followed this secret path, unsure where it would take them. And after some time of walking along this secret path, they found a chamber deep inside this cliff. And in this chamber was a glowing blue pool of water in the centre. And they walked over to that glowing pool of water. They put their hands in to feel the water, and it felt warm and comfortable. And then they sat there and they lowered their legs in, and it felt refreshing. And while they sat there with their legs dangling in the water, so they noticed some of that glowing passing up and over them, and it felt so comfortable, so comforting and calming. And then that light engulfed them. And it was almost like the light and the water were the same thing. It was almost like the water had covered their whole body, a little bit like sweat, only without a sweaty feeling. And they climbed out of the water. They tried to dry themselves off, but found that this glowing continued to remain on them. They didn't worry, it felt comfortable, but they wondered what it was. And they saw a door at the back of this chamber, and they opened the door and realized they were high up in a cliff, with a path leading down to a valley full of trees. And as they looked out, suddenly they realized that at first glance they hadn't noticed. But the birds flying in formation over the valley hadn't moved. At first glance they didn't pay attention to this, but on reflection they realized those birds were stationary. They noticed there was a stillness to the air. And they walked their way down the path from that point in the cliff, down into the valley. And they couldn't hear any sounds of the leaves rustling. They couldn't hear any sounds of birds singing. They couldn't hear the sounds of their own footsteps. They realized somehow time has frozen. And they didn't know how. And they wondered whether perhaps the time had frozen, or perhaps they'd come out of time in some way because of that water. And they walked along the valley. They explored through the valley. And they saw different animals not moving anywhere. Some animals were mid what they were doing. There was a squirrel hovering in the air, mid-jump from tree to tree. There was birds hovering motionless in the air. And they explored with curiosity. They didn't know or understand what was going on, but they knew this was a curious experience. They walked through the valley, and they found a clearing. They walked out into the clearing. They could see stationary insects over certain plants. And they continued walking. They settled down to have a picnic and found something unusual about this environment, that it was weird being out in nature like this and yet having no sounds at all. And they found that a really weird experience. But they also found it a beautiful experience. They enjoyed their picnic, and then noticed that the light or the water was dissipating from their bodies in the same way that you just dry out in the sun over time. And as it was dissipating, so time appeared to be moving very slowly, and the more they dried off in the sun, the faster time appeared to go, until after quite a while, suddenly time seemed to be going at normal speed again. They could hear the breeze again. They could notice rustling of leaves in the trees, see the movement of plants, insects flying around, birds flying around. And they thought it was a curious experience. And they knew they were supposed to learn something from the experience, and they wondered what. And they felt like they had a sense of wonder and serenity. There was a certain serene feeling to the experience they had. And they discussed with each other about the importance of being in the moment, of making the most of each moment, rather than being in the future, worrying about what the future might hold, or what might happen in the future, or being in the past, worrying about what's happened in the past, or what people might think, but just being in the moment. And they felt that perhaps that was what was being taught to them, that they needed to be in the moment, to learn to appreciate what is here and now. And they enjoyed their food. And then the sun was setting again, and so they sat down in the valley. They set up camp, sat out talking most of the night with a campfire, enjoying the crackling of the campfire, watching how the shadows danced with each flickering flame, and the smell of that campfire, before relaxing down for the night, gazing up at the stars, watching them twinkle and dance, wondering if there's anyone out there on a planet somewhere, lying down gazing up at the stars, watching them twinkle in the night sky for them, wondering whether there's anyone out there looking back at them. And they put an arm around each other, held each other tight, and drifted comfortably asleep. Then the next morning they had some breakfast. They took in the environment. They knew this was their last chance to see this location for a while. They walked back up to that cave. They walked through the cave. They came out of that door in that fake tree, walked through the woods and found their way back to the river. They camped again another night by the river. Before following that river all the way back to the lake. And they felt themselves walking slower, trying to make this trip last slightly longer, really trying to take in and absorb the experience and enjoy the experience, enjoy the companionship, enjoy the company of each other, and enjoy making the most of this time together. And they looked out over the lake. They saw people fishing, they saw people on boats. They admired the way the water flowed, the way the ripples moved, the way the air smelt fresh as it blew off the lake. They worked their way back up towards that village and stopped at the village to talk to friends about the trip they'd been on. They didn't say where that tree was exactly, but they talked about the trip they'd been on, some of the things they'd seen, some of the things they'd learned. And then they head back to the castle. To the familiar surroundings of their home, their workplace. And they settled down for the night. Knowing they had work in the morning, they settled down for the night. Still talking to each other about their time away, about the experience they just had, about their few days going exploring, and how they looked forward to going exploring again in the future, and whether they would go the same way, do the same kind of things, or go a different way and learn something new and find something else out. And they started already planning their future, planning future trips. and gradually their conversations calmed down as they found themselves gently and relaxing, drifting off to sleep in each other's arms, so calmly and relaxed asleep.